Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
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 Okay, great. Blessed is the one who reads the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it and take to heart what is written in it, because it is near. Because it will make it a bit easier. Yeah, I was thinking about it. Nope. Doesn't want to do that.
What's it doing, Record?
I'm trying to go into presentation mode.
It looks like it on this side.
Okay, it's not showing for me, but that's okay. All right, so let's turn to Revelation chapter 13. And Renee, do you mind me asking you to read verses 1 through 10?
Not at all.
Thank you. Revelation 13, verses 1 through 10.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Hear you great.
Great. And the dragon stood on the shore of the sea, and I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Men worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can make war against him?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise his authority for 42 months. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God, and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. He was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the book of life belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. He who has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints.
Thanks, Renee. Said if you had a paper and pen to keep that handy. Also, if you have an extra Bible on hand, that might also be helpful. If not, that's okay. We'll work through it. But we will be going heavy into Daniel chapter 7 today, in parallel with the verses we are reading here, we've just read. So there will be a lot of comparisons, and we will look at both very closely through tonight. There's going to be a lot of material to cover in a short time. So hang in there with me. And as always, interrupt. If you have any questions, anything to add, please feel free to jump in right away. Okay, so Renee just read out of Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 10. So that's all we'll be able to cover from Revelation tonight. We look at verse 1. Some translations where it says, "And the dragon stood on the shore of the sea." Some translations have that as "I stood." instead of the dragon stood, or he stood. And if you look at this, we're still not moving here. So give me a second. I've got to figure out what's going on because this is not advancing. Got some technical difficulties. Minimize that. Okay, can you all see Revelation 13:1 slide now?
Yes.
Okay, good.
And I'm going to do a little switching back and forth here myself. So I've got two Bibles, Creekcore, but I've got one is the interlinear. So if you ask me to read something, it might take me just a couple minutes to get back to which version to read.
That's okay, no problem. Okay, Revelation 13:1, or in some translations, this appears actually in 12:17. Like right at the end of chapter 12, you will see those words. He stood at the sea, or on the sea of the shore of the sea. Or depending on the translations, you see I stood. Like in the authorized version, it will say I stood.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, I was just going to say it like on the interlinear from the Greek, it's I stood.
Depends again which of the manuscripts it's pulling from. So if it says I stood, it's referring obviously to John standing right at the edge of the sea, as opposed to he stood, which would refer to the dragon. If you look at the Greek, kai estate, the word estate is he stood. That's the word that has sometimes, in some manuscripts, has a noon at the end to it. When the noon is at the end, it reads as I stood. And if the noon is dropped at the end, it reads he stood. So that's the difference. It's one letter difference. But most of the better manuscripts support he stood as opposed to I stood, and that fits the context better as we are reading and expounding on this. The breaking versus Revelation 12:17 or 13:1, again, that's minor differences between how the various translations have broken down the passage. So you will see it either at the end of chapter 12 or at the beginning of chapter 13. Both of these really do not make a change to the overall meaning that we are going to cover tonight. Any questions on this?
I guess I don't understand why there would be a question, because it's talking about the dragon becoming enraged, and then the dragon stood on the sand, and then it says that I saw a beast coming out of the sea, so it's like.
Right, so the point I was making is that some translations have I stood by it instead of the dragon stood. That's what I was referring to. And that just depends on if you're using one of the manuscripts that has the noon at the end of that estade word or not. But the best manuscripts do not have the noon, which means it's a better reference for even contextually for the dragon, because it continues the thought from chapter 12 where we left off last time. Okay, a little bit about the sea. The sea, since John was on which island? Patmos. Where's Patmos? No, it's not Tennessee.
It was just off the coast. It was like 30, wasn't it like 30 miles or something off the coast?
Yes. Tracy said in the sea. I heard Tennessee. Okay, but yes, it's an island in the Mediterranean near Greece, but in Turkey. But so the sea here would be physically, if you're going to look at it in a physical sense, that would be the Mediterranean Sea. But really, it has a much broader concept here, much broader meaning. It also represents the cosmic deep and the abode of the monster of the sea. So if someone can look up Isaiah 27:1, and then someone else look up Psalm 74:13, please.
Okay. This is Isaiah.
Isaiah 27:1.
The Lord will punish with his sword, his fierce, and great, and powerful sword. Leviathan, the gliding serpent. Leviathan, the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea.
Okay, Leviathan, monster of the sea. That's Isaiah 27:1, and then Psalm 74:13.
I have that one. It was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters.
Okay, thank you. So remember the story with the disciples, with Jesus in the boat, and then there's this massive storm that comes on. We read about that in, Mark chapter 4, for example. And the disciples are absolutely horrified and terrified, and Jesus is sleeping in the boat. Remember that?
Yep.
Well, background to the disciples' terror during the storm is their cultural understanding that there is this sea monster that stirs up the waters to malign and terrorize all the sailors. So this is a cultural understanding of the times back then. So that was potentially an element that was attributing to their fear and terror during the storm, not just that they're just going to topple over, but that they're going to actually be destroyed and killed by this quote unquote sea monster. It's not stated in scripture, but this is one of those cultural mythical beliefs of the time. But this is an interesting thing to keep in mind. But when you're looking at sea, there is that aspect of cosmic deep or the abode of the monster of the sea in the mindset of the people at the time. In Revelation, though, it represents all the nations and the world powers. All the nations and the world powers. You can see that in Revelation 20, verse 8. But the idea is that the dragon is now on the sea, quote unquote, basically facing all the nations. Facing all the nations and all the world powers. At the time, Judeans experienced Rome as coming out from the sea. So this is significant for us to understand. A monster coming out from the sea represents a world power. And in this case here, it is a very clear alignment with Rome. But are we talking about physical Rome, or are we talking about a different kind of Rome? This is where we're going to look at two different passages, and we are going to turn to Daniel 7, stay in chapter 13 of Revelation, and we're going to go into Daniel 7, and this is like an open book quiz that we're going to be doing after we get through this, okay? So take notes. This is where you need your paper and pen. And here's my one question. What are the similarities that you capture between Daniel 7 and Revelation 13, 1 through 10? What are the similarities that stand out to you between Daniel 7 and Revelation 13, 1 through 10? So to help you, I will read out loud all of Daniel chapter 7. So listen closely. You can follow in your Bibles, of course, and take notes of whatever strikes you that resembles what we have just now read from Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 10. You're following me so far?
Oh, good.
All good. All right. Let me find Daniel. Daniel chapter 7. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream, and visions passed through his mind as he was lying on his bed. He wrote down the substance of the dream. Daniel said, "In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me were the four winds of heaven churning up the great sea. Four great beasts, each different from the others, came up out of the sea. The first was like a lion, and it had the wings of an eagle. I watched until its wings were torn off, and it was lifted from the ground so that it stood on 2 feet like a man, and the heart of a man was given to it. And there before me was a second beast, which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up and eat your fill of flesh.' After that I looked, and there before me was another beast, one that looked like a leopard. On its back it had 4 wings like those of a bird. This beast had 4 heads, and it was given authority to rule. After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a 4th beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns. While I was thinking about the horns, there before me was another horn, a little one, which came up among them, and 3 of the first horns were uprooted before it. This horn had eyes like the eyes of a man and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I looked, thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was as white as snow, the hair of his head was white like wool. His throne was flaming with fire, and its wheels were all ablaze. A river of fire was flowing, coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands attended him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court was seated, and the books were opened. Then I continued to watch because of the boastful words the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All peoples, nations, and men of every language worshiped him. I hope you're picking up the similarities here as I'm reading. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. I, Daniel, was troubled in spirit, and the visions that passed through my mind disturbed me. I approached one of those standing there and asked him the true meaning of all this. So he told me and gave me the interpretation of these things. The four great beasts are four kingdoms that will rise from the earth. But the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. Then I wanted to know the true meaning of that fourth beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws, the beast that crushed and destroyed, devoured its victims, and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head, and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell, the horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. Verse 21, as I watched, this horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The fourth beast is a fourth kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress his saints and try to change the set times and the laws. The saints will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will set and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be handed over to the saints, the people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship and obey him. This is the end of the matter. And I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. All right. So, what did you capture from the similarities that I just read and Revelation chapter 13?
It's a dream.
Dream versus vision, yeah.
There's an ocean involved.
An ocean or sea was involved in both. The monster coming out, the four beasts in Daniel coming out of the sea, and we see the monster in Revelation coming out of the sea.
Yeah, it's almost like it's everything. It's just Daniel is explaining what the 4 beasts are. So it's like he told you what they were, and then when in John's vision, he didn't tell you that he didn't go through the detail of these were kings. This, the last one that's more different than the other one. Like he's going through the details of what John's vision is. It's almost like you read a book backwards.
It's interesting, but Renee, since you brought this up, go with me to Revelation chapter 12 and read verses 12 through 14. Revelation chapter, did I say 12? I meant 17. I'm sorry. Revelation 17, and read verses 12 through 14.
The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will make war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will overcome them because he is the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers.
Thank you. So John does tell us a little bit, but later on, not in the immediate context. Tells us a bit. Daniel goes in a bit more detail. That's right. What else do we see in Daniel that resembles chapter 13 in Revelation?
He spoke boastfully.
The horn that spoke boastfully and blasphemously.
Mm-hmm.
And animal symbols, lion, bear.
The symbolism with the lion, the bear, and the leopard.
Same animals.
Yeah.
Because all will worship him.
The worship symbolism, that's right.
There was war waged against the saints.
War waged against the saints, right. We read that in Daniel 7, and we read it in verse 7 of chapter 13, Revelation.
Everyone will worship the beast.
I'm sorry?
Everyone will worship.
Everyone will worship the beast. Did you notice the phrase? Every language, every people, every tribe. Same one that appears also in Revelation. So it's very clear that there's a lot of parallelism here. And John is drawing a lot from Daniel 7. Now let's look a little bit more closely at this. And I've got this figure up here to help us. This comes from Zondervan NIV Study Bible. I put it out there that captures the visions in Daniel. And what we're interested in is that second column that I have highlighted here, the vision in chapter 7. The visions that Daniel had, this in chapter 7, all of them came to pass. Now, if you remember, we talked about prophecy and biblical oracles or proclamations often being multidimensional, having a temporal meaning, but also an eschatological meaning. We talked about this a few times, right? So this is an example that clearly illustrates this, where everything that the vision that we just read in Daniel actually came to pass and was completely fulfilled. But it also points to a future time. Because how do we know this? Because John underscores it in his vision. John sees a similar vision, but it's a bit, there are variances and changes, and let's just say it's more pulled into the eschatological scene, and I'll break it out for you here shortly. But for Daniel, the lion was Babylon, the bear represented Persia, the leopard was Greece, specifically Alexander the Great, who was compared to a leopard in his swift conquering of the lands that he attacked. And the fourth one, the terrifying and frightening beast, referred specifically to Rome. Any questions about this?
Nope.
Okay, so let's see how let's look at the comparisons now a little more closely. Revelation 13:1, Daniel 7:2, beasts coming out of the sea. Revelation 13:2 and Daniel chapter 7, verse 6, resembled a leopard, like the third beast of Daniel. Right? Feet like those of a bear in Revelation 13:2. That's the second beast of Daniel chapter 7. Mouth like that of a lion, like the first beast of Daniel in verse 4 of chapter 7. Terrifying and frightening and very powerful beast, Daniel 7:7, that had 10 horns, just like the beast in Revelation 13:1, with 10 horns. The beast in Revelation 13:1 represents the fourth beast of Daniel chapter 7, the more terrifying one. The difference here is that the beast described in Revelation actually incorporates all the features of the first three beasts of Daniel. In addition, so the message here is clear that the Revelation beast is more fearsome and more powerful than all of Daniel's beasts combined. That's the message. This new beast that is coming out of the sea in Revelation chapter 13 is going to be more fearsome and more powerful than all of Daniel's beasts combined. And will be raised and empowered by Satan himself. We read that also in Revelation. He will be empowered to dominate, to conquer, and to destroy. So John is calling on the imagery from Daniel chapter 7, and he will recognize that these prophecies came true with all the nations that we talked about, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But now he's talking about this in a more expansive way. And he's saying that this beast that is coming out of the sea is even going to be encompassing all of the four, but it'll be even more powerful. Why? Because it will have the power of Satan handed to it. You read that in Revelation 12 or 13, verse 2, the dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and his great authority. So this is a power that will be raised and empowered by the very power of Satan himself. The fourth beast of Daniel, as I said, is Rome. So the symbolism here that John is trying to explain to the churches is that there will be a revived Roman Empire. Something that was like Rome, but is going to be much more terrified. It's like Rome coming back to life, a revived Roman power, but the difference is that they will receive the dragon's power, Satan's power. It will receive his throne and authority, as we just read in verse 2. The blasphemous name that is written on the beast. Why? Because the beast will set itself up as God and will seek man's worship. Can someone look up Isaiah chapter 14, verses 13 through 15, please? Isaiah 14, 13 through 15.
You said in your hearts, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned in the mount of assembly on the utmost heights of the sacred mountain. 15.
15.
I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to the grave, to the depths of the pits.
This is a prophetic word about Satan when he wanted to become like God and rise above him. That's the blasphemous part of it. And if you remember from our studies, Roman emperors often set themselves up as gods. and they demanded worship. In fact, Domitian, one of the emperors, called himself Lord and God and demanded people to worship him. Nero, same thing. So this brings to mind a lot of the blasphemous nature of the Roman Empire of the time. And what John is saying here is that this will be revived in the end days. This empire will be brought back to life as such. A revived Roman Empire will set itself up as God and will demand the worship of man. Any questions?
So, Krikor, do we think that that's why some people think that John is more of a history, because some of these things did occur, right? In those days, including some level of mark for buying and selling, authorities exalting themselves to the level of God, as opposed to something that's going to happen again. But many people still think that Revelation is a history book.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. There will be a huge difference in this, in the sense that this will be a united world power. And if you hold that thought, I will come to it here as we progress.
Okay.
Because there's a very distinct variance here, an element that is highly demonic and something that hasn't happened yet. Okay, moving on. 10 horns of Daniel's fourth beast, verse 24 of Daniel chapter 7, were 10 Hellenistic kings between Alexander the Great, who was known as the leopard, and Antiochus the Fourth, who is considered actually as the prototype Antichrist of the Old Testament. The little horn of Daniel 7:8. The thing to keep in mind is that those kings, the 10 kings that we see symbolically as horns, the horns represent kings, rulers that are going to arise at the time. 10 horns, Daniel 7:24, and Revelation 17:12 through 14. 10 rulers will rise up out of the demonic rule of the beast. Now, based on Revelation 17 and the language, they seem to be rising very quickly and subsequent to each other during those 42 months, where the beast will be given free rein to do whatever he wants to do. The 3.5 years of the Great Tribulation. The little horn, being the Antichrist, will also start little, quote unquote, but will quickly rise to power to dominate. He's considered as the 8th king and belongs to the 7. We read that in Revelation 7, verses 9 through 11. Revelation, did I say 7? 17. I'm getting my numbers off today. So Revelation 17, Renee, can I have you read that? Revelation 17, 9 through 11.
All right, 1 second. (17, 9 to 11). So earlier we read 9 to 13, so 9 to 11. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction.
an eighth king who belongs to the seven, who will also be going to his destruction. So a lot of cryptic language here, but John is reminding us of the prophecy in Daniel chapter 7, but also letting us know that this will be a ruler. He will have power. He will be given Satan's authority and Satan's power and control. And he will be as a king, as an eighth king, because he will belong to the seven before him. The heads are seven hills. They're reference to Rome. Okay, Rome sits on seven hills. Now we come to verse 3, fatal wound. What is all that about? One of the heads of the beast seemed to have had a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed, and the whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Nero was one evil emperor at the time. He was the one who burned Rome and blamed the Christians and triggered a massive persecution, terrorizing all believers, burning them to the stake, torturing them, crucifying them, treating them with the most horrible imaginable ways. We are told that he killed himself, and because of that, many of his followers at the time either did not believe it, that he is dead, or believed that he was going to come back to life and actually lead the nation again. As late as 88, now he died in 68, 20 years later, we still see people showing up on the scene claiming to be Nero returned to life, just to garner a following. So the reference here seems to be bringing something to mind in reference to Nero, of him having died, coming back to life, but the idea is pointing very clearly to Rome. Basically, Nero being the head of Rome, therefore representing Rome itself. The interesting thing here is the verbiage. The fatal wound that seemed to have healed there's a parallel here to the wounds of Christ, right, and the resurrection. Except that this is a counterfeit resurrection. We talked about Nero, but this symbolism basically is a reference to the once dead Roman Empire. The idea here is that during the Great Tribulation, this empire will be revived by Satan to do his work and to be used against God and his people. Any question on the meaning and symbolism here?
I don't think it's a question on the symbolism. I mean, that it will be a fake type of resurrection, or appear to be a supernatural healing of a wound. I guess the question is what does that look like? I mean, fatal wound still feels a little bit generic. A fatal wound will be healed. So we assume it'll be healed by this power. Is it the fourth or the fifth? I've lost count now. The fourth?
The fourth.
And who is he going to heal? The fatal wound, is the fatal wound a war? Is the fatal wound a physical wound and you know what I mean? Like, to resurrect something, like, people can be in awe of many things. It doesn't have to be bringing a person back to life. We're just kind of assuming that would be the case. Is that fair?
Except that we're talking about nations here.
Right.
So it's a world power. So there will be a world power that will arise that will remind us very much of the time Rome was in power. So it will be as if Rome is back. There will be a lot of symbolism that points to that reality. And again, I'm coming to more details on this.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because it just like, I guess in saying that, are we saying that the fatal wound that appears to be healed, I get that it'll be like Rome is back, like there will be this ultimate power kind of taking over as a, if you want to call it one world or whatever, but the wound that's healed isn't that Rome is back, right? So
Well, Rome is no more now. Once was, now is not.
sure, but people wouldn't, so people today wouldn't see Rome as a wound to be healed.
Correct, but remember the message is more to the meaning and the intention of what is being communicated here, not so much the actual detail of the imagery. The idea here is that we had a power that persecuted and tortured Christians many years ago. That power is no longer here. But that power will be revived and they will again torture Christians.
It says the saints will be handed over to him for a time in Daniel.
Yes.
Is that what it's referring to?
Correct.
And so what is times and a half time?
So that's 3.5 years. Yeah, so as we talked about this in one of our sessions, time, times, and half a time is a reference to 3.5 years, time referring to a year. It's also the same as 42 months in, as mentioned in Revelation, also referenced as 1,260 days, mentioned in 3 different ways in Revelation.
Well, which one's right?
Thanks, Marty. So Renee, I don't know if I answered your question, but hold to your thought a little bit longer.
Okay.
Okay. Daniel 7, verses 8, 11, and 25, and then chapter 11, 36 through 39. We read those verses and then compare that to Revelation 13, verses 5 through 6. The boasting and the blasphemy that's going on is the ultimate attack against God and all that belongs to him. I read chapter 9, and let me look at chapter 11. Verses 36 on. So I advanced this and I didn't mean to. Okay, verse 36. The king will do as he pleases. This is Daniel chapter 11. He will exalt and magnify himself above every god and will say unheard of things against the God of gods. He will be successful until the time of wrath is completed. For what has been determined must take place. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers, or for the one desired by women, nor will he regard any god except, but will exalt himself above them all. Instead of them, he will honor a god of fortresses, a god unknown to his fathers. He will honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He will attack the mightiest fortresses with the help of a foreign god and will greatly honor those who acknowledge him. He will make them rulers over many people and will distribute the land at a price. So the king will set himself up, will exalt himself up above all gods. Waging war against the saints, verse 21 of chapter 7, verse 22, compared with Revelation 13, verse 7, given power to make war against the saints. Daniel 7:25, saints handed over to him for time, times, and half a time. Seen again in Revelation 13, verses 5 and 7, as 42 months. Daniel 7:18-27, but the saints of the Most High will receive the kingdom and will possess it forever. The story has already found an ending. The ending is well known. The saints win in the end because God wins. The power of the beast and its exercise of authority against the saints will be limited for 42 months or 3.5 years. We see that Daniel 7:25, Revelation 13:5, 12, 6, and 14. So we're talking about the period of the Great Tribulation. That's when the beast will be able to exercise its full authority against the church and will have all the nations subjected to him. The Lamb will overcome, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. Revelation 17:14. Compare that with Daniel 7:25. The end has long been determined. Okay, those are the similarities. Let's move on. Revelation 12:4. Did I have that right? Not 12:4, 13:4. That's a typo. Revelation 13:4. I'm way off with all my numbers today. Men worship the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worship the beast and ask, who is like the beast? Who can make war against it? So what is being mentioned here is a world power that is being set up by Satan that will unite nations under him. Now, how many times have we run into rulers in the past, historically, who wanted to conquer the whole world? Right? How many times have we seen this? Many, many times, right? You know, the world power, that one single power, one single authority to be over the entire world. Has anyone succeeded yet?
No.
No. But this will happen according to what we are reading here in chapter 13. There will be a one world power because it will be empowered as such by Satan himself. He will raise a world power that will be empowered by Satan and will bring the entire world under his control and dominion. It will be a single world power. And will appear as a revived Rome. That's the symbolism that is being given here in Revelation chapter 13. When that happens, this world empire will exercise its authority in a way that will force people either to obey and follow its authority or to be completely cut off and rejected. And we're coming to that mark, 666 mark, soon. I'll be talking about that next week. So apostasy in those days, it's not just about rejecting God, as in verse 4. Apostasy will result literally in the worship of Satan himself. And not just Satan, but also his appointed ruler. Because we read in verse 4 that people were worshiping the dragon and the beast. The beast meaning the world power that came out of the sea. There's no more middle or neutral ground. One will either worship God and oppose Satan and his forces, or reject God and worship his Satan. Now note the emphasis on the extent of the slander in verse 6. Satan and his beasts will come against God directly. They will come against his name, the name of God, his dwelling place, those who live in heaven, and the saints living at the time. The attack is on everything that belongs to God, everything that reminds people of God, everything that has anything to do with God will be under attack by Satan and his beasts. And those beasts will be empowered to do that.
So now how is this dwelling be attacked and those who live in heaven be attacked?
Through blasphemous words. It's the blasphemy, right? It's the words, it's the mockery, it's the antagonistic verbiage, the hatefulness, anything that is obscene will be pronounced against God and everything that represents him. Satan's rule and attack during this limited period will be literally an all-out war against everything that God stands for and all that belongs to him. That includes us Christians living in those days.
Are we there? Yes.
Are we there yet?
I'm headed there.
We're headed there. Daniel 7:23, we read that this beast will devour the whole earth. Revelation 13:7-8 says, every tribe, people, language, and nation will be subject to Satan. And all inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast. But notice what verse 8 says, that there's an exception here. What's the exception?
Those who belong to the Lamb.
Yes, those who do not belong to the Lamb. Those who are not true believers will be the ones who will be subject to Satan and worshipers of the enemy. Any questions so far? So remember, the reference to all inhabitants of the earth who will worship the beast is qualified here in verse 8 by all whose names have not been written in the book of life, and those who do not belong to the Lamb. In other words, the true believers will refuse to worship Satan and his beasts. We talked about this last time, but God's faithful, the true believers, will overcome how? We read this last time in Revelation chapter 12. By the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. The message is this. This world power and the rulers that are going to follow to be raised up by Satan will do everything in their power to come against Christians, to come against everything that represents God or stands for God. But no matter what they do, they will not be fully victorious. Some will be conquered. Some will fall away. There will be a falling away. We are told that. Jesus mentioned that. Some will be martyred. But the ones who stand and persist to the end are the ones who are cleansed by the blood of the Lamb, who are not afraid to give their lives for their faith, to hold on to Christ to the very end, and who always speak the truth of the gospel, who do not proclaim falsity from God's word. If you missed last time, I encourage you to listen to last time's study, because we looked at this in depth last week or 2 weeks ago. He who has an ear, let him hear. We hear that, we see that many times in the New Testament. I've got multiple references here for you. Jesus said that repeatedly. He who has an ear, let him hear. And then we see that repeated 7 times in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. So let's look at this real quick to remind ourselves. Revelation chapter 2. And what I'm going to ask is to listen closely to the connection between hearing what the Spirit says and the words, to him who overcomes. Revelation 2. Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death. That's Revelation 2, 10 and 11. Revelation 2, verse 7. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give the right to eat from the tree of life, which is in the paradise of God. Revelation 2, verse 17. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on it, known only to him who receives it. Revelation 2, verse 29. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Before it in verse 26, to him who overcomes and does my will to the end, I will give authority over the nations that will try to destroy, over the nations that will try to kill. Verse 6 in chapter 3. We'll start with verse 5. He who overcomes will like them be dressed in white. In white, I will never blot out his name from the book of life, but will also acknowledge his name before my Father and his angels. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Verse 13. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Before it in verse 12, him who overcomes, I will make a pillar in the temple of my God. Never again will he leave it. I will write on him the name of my God and the name of the city of my God, the New Jerusalem, which is coming down out of heaven. In verse 20, 21, 22 of chapter 3. To him who overcomes, I will give the right to sit with me on my throne, just as I overcame and sat down with my Father on his throne. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit is saying. And here again in chapter 13, verse 9, he who has an ear, let him hear. You think it's repeated enough times? It's very clear what the message of the Holy Spirit is and what Jesus is trying to tell his church. If you say that you can hear, then hear this. If you overcome, you will win. If you overcome to the very end, you will overcome the enemy. If you will persist, if you will hang in there, if you will fight this battle, if you resist the enemy, if you do not love your own self, even to the point of death, you will overcome. And then we have a quote in Revelation 13, which seems a little bit odd. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he will be killed. This is a direct quote from Jeremiah chapter 15, verse 2, word for word. Here it's a reference, though, to the law of divine retribution. When, if you look at Matthew 26:52, for example, where Jesus tells Peter, put the sword away, right? He who kills with the sword will be killed by the sword. The idea is that those people that are going to attack the Christians will have their judgment day before the Lord. The final battle against Satan and his forces will not be won through military power, but by the power of God, who will defeat the beast by the breath of his mouth and the splendor of his coming. Can someone look that up, please? 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 8, please. Second, go ahead.
I have it. Okay, and that's 8. And then shall that wicked be revealed, whom the Lord shall consume with the spirit of his mouth, and shall destroy with the brightness of his coming.
Thank you, Carol. The chapter, the section ends in verse 10. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. Verse 10. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. We will have to be ready, we'll have to be prepared, we'll have to stand strong, enduring, patient, and faithful to the end. Remember the exhortation, to him who overcomes. To summarize, Revelation 13, 1 through 10 predicts a future satanic world government that will finally give the world what it has often tried to achieve: a single world power and a single government that governs the whole world. This satanic world government will also create a world religion that will be empowered by Satan himself for the single purpose of causing the whole world to worship him. Renee, does that help answer some of the questions from earlier?
Not really, because we're still dealing with the fatal wound. So I don't know that I see that as the fatal wound. I don't see the connection. The only way I could see the connection of the fatal wound to a nation or region is if we took what's happening now, or you're looking at kind of the, a peace, right, that is created. I think people would see that as a fatal wound that is healing, right, with the chaos in the world. and the many conflicts in the world. That I could see, but I don't know that that anybody would associate it with Rome.
Well, maybe or maybe not. If you're aware of the history, and we see a lot of the activities that are recreated by Rome at the time, like the way Rome handled itself, it will bring to mind a lot of the atrocities that Rome did in those days.
Yeah, and I think people do probably understand that history. I just don't equate it to a healing of a fatal wound. That to me is the key.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Erica? Yeah, when you talk about the beast rises up out of the sea, which is the people, and creates a one world government. But it takes a fatal blow, and then the Antichrist has to step up at that moment, and then he takes over the entire world as the leader of the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
So he's talking about a government. It's not a person who takes
Right.
a fatal wound. It's the beast that takes the fatal wound, and then the Antichrist is the one that comes and revives it.
Right. Yes, and that I can absolutely see. I just don't know that I would equate it with a particular, like with Rome. That was my point. I
So
could see a nation. Uh-huh.
Well, Rome is a similitude.
Go ahead.
Rome is a similitude of
Right.
what it will look like. They were mean, they were vicious,
Yeah.
and so that's what the beast is going to look like. But in Daniel 7, it talks about the Antichrist, who is instead of Christ, will come in with peace and prosperity. So he's going to come in and take over all the cruelty and bring peace to the world, but it's going to be a counterfeit peace.
Yeah. So I'm not talking about an actual Rome as in Rome, Italy, or the country Italy. I'm talking about a Rome-like empire.
Yeah, okay. And that makes sense.
Yeah. So if sorry, I wasn't, but thank you, David.
So Creekor, instead of Rome, like we think of Rome, you're talking about the Holy Roman Empire.
Like something like.
Something like
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to be the Catholic as being the. Let me repeat this. It's not going to be the Pope being the.
Can't hear you.
He's going to be. Rome is a similitude of what it's going to be like, but it's not going to be the Pope. The Antichrist is going to come in as a god for all religions. So when you drive around and you see these bumper stickers that say coexist and have the symbols of all the religions, the Antichrist is going to come in and he's going to be the god for all of that when the beast takes its fatal wound.
And that's correct. Yeah, I'm not talking about Rome or Catholics or anything like that. As the physical Rome, as in Italy, just to be clear. We're talking about the symbolism associated with the empire at the time that will be duplicated in much more viciousness in the end days, hence revived in that concept, and united under a world religion. The whole purpose of Satan, since he decided to rebel against God, he had one single agenda. What was that agenda?
To blaspheme the Lord.
Blaspheme the Lord.
and sit on the throne.
Sit on the throne. Basically, and God's creation, instead of worship, they started to worship him instead. Ever since the original rebellion, his original rebellion against God, that we read about this in Isaiah 14, he plunged the world into sin. And since then, he's been operating covertly, sometimes overtly, but mostly covertly, using deception and lies. Except in the Great Tribulation period, his agenda will be very obvious. It'll be very transparent. He'll dominate for 3.5 years until the moment he is completely judged and destroyed by God. But during that limited time frame, limited window, he will have utmost control and he will force people to worship him. Much like the Babylonian kings issued decrees for the people to worship their images and to bow down. Remember, Daniel refused to do that and he was thrown in the den of lions. Same thing, except on a much larger, broader scale globally. Any questions?
No, I think this part's pretty clear.
Okay. I want to close with Habakkuk 2, verse 3. For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end, and it will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and will not delay.
No, some of this reminds me of Matthew chapter 11, around verse 14, where Jesus is talking and he says, if you are willing to accept it, he, John the Baptist, is the Elijah who wants to come. Whoever has ears, let them hear. So that same phrase is repeated. And even though I never really understood the connection of how John the Baptist was to come, but even, and maybe in the same way, we won't recognize the new Rome to come up in the end. But he said it, that Elijah was in this, that John the Baptist was in the spirit of Elijah. And I think it would probably be the same thing here, talking about Rome, whoever has ears, let them hear. So
it's a good point. I don't know if you could hear what Darlene was saying.
Not quite all of it. Could you do you mind repeating just a little bit?
No, not at all. So what Darlene was saying, she was referring to what Jesus said of John the Baptist when he said, it reminded her of that, where he said, if you will believe it or if you will have it, he was the Elijah who was to appear or to come, right? And then he had the words came, he who has an ear, let him hear, repeated in that passage. So what she's saying is that this could be a similar scenario on a much more global scale, where we have a reappearance of what was a world power is going to be a new world power. And again, the phrase, he who has an ear, let him hear, repeated in Revelation 13.
So they were expecting Elijah to come again, and he did in the form of John the Baptist, as it was foretold, but I don't think a lot of people recognize that at the time.
Just like they didn't recognize you.
Right.
Yeah, they didn't recognize the Elijah just like they didn't recognize Jesus, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, they were They were expecting a king. They got a king, but they didn't expect a carpenter that rode into Jerusalem on an ass, right? Like that wasn't their vision. It was to be dressed in gold and, sit in a palace and, and on a throne. And so that was, they weren't expecting the humility at which God was coming in the flesh to save and to have a relationship with his people. They missed the humility part completely.
That's correct. They missed the whole purpose as well. They were expecting a military coup.
Yeah.
But the kingdom is not about anything military. It's about the spiritual revival and the eternal life that he brings, overcoming the forces of darkness.
Yeah, we're going to make that same mistake twice, I'm afraid.
But we've read it, and as we say, being forewarned is being forearmed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's there for a reason. It's there to alert us. It's there to teach us. It's there to prepare us. What are we doing about it? How do we prepare? We don't prepare by saying, oh, we won't even be here, so don't worry about it. That's certainly not preparing.
You prepare by certainly studying, but it is preparing your hearts, and it's also bringing as many people to Christ as you can as well.
Yeah. How else can we prepare? We prepare by preparing our own hearts. We prepare through prayer. We prepare by sharing the gospel and telling people about what's going to happen, those who will believe, those who will receive. But is there any actionable things we can do beyond
Boot camp.
boot camp? What do you mean by boot camp?
Anybody that prepares for battle has to become, you exercise, you become strong. You develop a regimen, you stay alert, you stay immersed in God's word, and you watch and find men of Issachar who can help you.
Yeah. Could you hear that online?
Yeah, I could hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah, the full armor of God. We need to understand what the full armor of God is, and we take action by putting it on and going out to battle with the helmet of salvation, the sword of the Spirit, the breastplate of righteousness, the shoes of the piece of the gospel, the belt of truth. We just, we have to put these things on, and we have to understand what they are, and that's our weapons of warfare when it comes time to stand.
Yeah, we teach, we exercise our faith, we exercise our position in Christ, who we are as his children. We don't run away from that responsibility of being a Christian and a disciple and a mentor to others. But here's another thing. We also teach. We teach our children. We teach those around us. We spread the word. In the Old Testament, we read about how the people forgot the law of Moses. They didn't have it to read it, and they weren't taught. And so they went into a period of time where they had zero knowledge of who God is until it was suddenly discovered. And then they started reading it. And Ezra started promoting the knowledge of God again. And the people came to understand, well, wait a second, God has already told us who he is. We make sure that God's word is spoken and promoted and strengthened and encouraged among our children, among our loved ones. And we don't dilute his message. We don't make it politically correct. We don't join the ranks of church leaders who try to promote false Christianities. and a false message. We expose the wickedness and the lying. We speak against it. That's part of overcoming by the word of their testimony. That's part of having to speak the word of truth, even when everything around us is a lie. Standing up against the popular stand in the world.
I think on the practical side, being more self-sufficient.
Being self-sufficient.
If I am not able to buy and sell, because I don't have the mark, I need to be able to grow a garden, grow some food, for me, for other people.
So that's another good point. Well, Darlene is talking about lack of dependency, right? So a time will come when we won't be able to buy and sell if we refuse the mark of the beast, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you eat? How do you feed your children? How do you take
Christian black market?
Christian black market? Yeah, and that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, Olivia was talking about growing in underground gardens. Kind of thinking of the future.
You guys, your men's retreat with the swords.
Men's retreat with the swords.
Yeah, this is long before your time. Jim, I'm not sure whether you were there. Tracy, you were there. We got the big, long swords and had them watch Kingdom of Heaven.
Okay.
You've seen the movie where they had to swing the swords and fight, and where they would swing these great big old claymores for hours on end. So I let the guys use, that was our connection to God's word, being able to fight with our swords.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if your family depended on you protecting them with one of these swords, how long could you go? How long could you swing that? So, well, you remember that, Tracy?
I do, but
Yeah,
it's not very long.
well, it was, there weren't very many people that could do it for more than a minute. They're heavy and strong, and it's like, okay, if we're gonna be strong enough to fight the enemy, thinking of it even in a physical sense, transfer it to spiritual sense, then I mean, they had to be prepared for battle.
Yeah.
They could not, and I always used to say the time to learn to swim is not when you're drowning.
Yeah. Yes.
You learn to swim before.
Long before. That's right. Hope you could hear all of that.
Yeah, no, I definitely could. And I know we've talked before about, independence and which I do think is important. And I think for every generation it has, because it's the part where you're not a slave to the world, right? Where if somebody fires you from your job, you can pick up, something else, right? You don't, it's not losing your job that all of a sudden you are without food or skill sets to, to try and, make ends meet. In this case, it'll certainly be a lot different, but what that independence means this time would be a community of Christians, right? That do have to go underground or pull resources together, because owning a home won't matter. And having a garden certainly might matter. Those types of things would be important to pull resources. So the things that we think are independent won't really be what defines independence at that point. It won't just be financial freedom, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not just financial freedom.
Right.
Any other thoughts, questions?
Well, for me, it's not dependent on the things of the world, but interdependent with other believers in Christ, like in the book of Acts.
That's a good point. Yeah, because this is an important point in the sense that we have become very individualistic in our ways of life, especially here in the West. The day will come when we need to depend on each other for survival. Wow, that's a source. Marty brought it in. Let's bring it up so people can see. Come on, Marty, come on up here.
Okay, go ahead, Newton.
Demonstrate.
Grab a hold of it like that. Yeah.
Stand right here.
Right here.
There we go.
Where are we at? I can't see anybody. Oh, there you are. I don't know if it, probably can't.
Look at the other.
I can see.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go.
Wow.
Okay,
There you
is
go.
that showing?
Back up so they can see.
Back up a bit more. There you go. No, you're good. You're good.
Okay, catch. Here, go ahead and lift that for a minute. Just,
That's pretty heavy.
yeah, can you imagine swinging that all day?
We're fighting with this all day.
Yeah,
That's
I mean, that,
insane. Yeah.
we didn't even have to fight. I just asked him to swing,
What does that weigh? 10 pounds?
at least.
10 pounds at least. Imagine having to fight with something like that. It's scary.
Remember that, Gracie?
I do remember that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's making me tired.
Have a hold of that.